A debt-pressed planter arrives at the governor's mansion with a 10-year-old child on his arm, while chandeliers blaze and silk gowns rustle in shocked silence. But when fever strikes upstairs, the girl reads Latin like a scholar and catches a doctor's deadly mistake. Thunder crashes as she spots forged seals in official papers, her sharp eyes seeing what powerful men thought they'd hidden. The county clerk's hand trembles. A rival planter's smile turns cold. Storm water rises in the streets, trapping everyone inside as accusations fly, and ledger books reveal the same children sold twice stolen lives, forged documents, and a conspiracy that reaches the highest offices. Lantern light flickers on courthouse steps, where a crowd demands answers. When a child's voice cuts through the lies of grown men, and the truth threatens to destroy fortunes built on deception, will her memory be enough to break the chains, or will those who profit from darkness silence her forever? The biscuits cooled on the pine board table, while Lila hummed low in her throat. The sound came without thought, threading through the kitchen like smoke from the banked coals. Outside, the kennel dogs stirred and settled back to sleep. Silas Marrow sat heavy in the ladder-back chair, his boot heels drumming the floor. The lamplight caught the worry lines around his eyes and the red creeping up his neck. "That fool Tate Harlan," he muttered, crushing a letter between his fists, "dares me to bring a curiosity to the governor's ball. Says it'll be the talk of the county." Aunt Mercy's spoon scraped the bottom of the pot. She was past 60, bent from years over wash tubs and cooking fires, but her eyes stayed sharp as new pennies. "Talk ain't always good talk, Mr. Silas. I know what I'm doing." The words came out harder than he meant. Silas looked across the dim kitchen to where Lila stood by the window, her small hands folded. 10 years old, quick as a sparrow, quiet as dawn mist. "The girl's coming with me, tonight." The spoon stopped scraping. Isaiah Reed lifted his grey head from where he sat mending harness by the hearth. At 63, he'd seen enough of the world to know when trouble was brewing. "To the riverfront? That's patrol country after dark. I've got papers." Silas pulled a worn pass from his vest pocket. "Old ones, but they'll do." Isaiah's weathered fingers worked the leather strap through the buckle. The thread whispered against itself. "Patroller's been jumpy lately. Talk of runaways heading north. Let them talk." Silas stood and paced to the window. Through the glass, the morning fog hung thick as cotton batting. "Tate thinks he's got me cornered with these debt papers, thinks I'm finished." He turned back to the room. "Well, maybe it's time to show the county what Marrow ingenuity looks like." Lila's humming stopped. The silence stretched tight as a fiddle string. Aunt Mercy wiped her hands on her apron, the cloth damp from dishwater. "Child don't need to be part of your quarrel with Tate Harlan. It's not a quarrel, it's business." Silas's voice carried a bitter edge. "And she'll be safer at my side than here if the creditors come calling." That much was true, and they all knew it. Debt collectors didn't distinguish between property and people when they came to settle accounts. Isaiah rose from his chair, the old wood creaking under him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a strip of blue ribbon, faded but clean. "Miss Lila," his voice gentled like he was talking to a spooked horse, "you take this, keep it close. Help you mind what's true when everything else gets confused." Lila stepped forward and took the ribbon. Her fingers were small against Isaiah's calloused palm. "Thank you." The words came soft, but Silas caught something in them, a steadiness that didn't belong in a child's voice. He shook the feeling away. "We leave within the hour," he said. "Get your shawl." Lila nodded and turned to go. As she passed the window, she began humming again. The sound drifted back to them, low and sweet, with a pattern that seemed to pull at something deep in the chest. Outside, the kennel dogs settled into sleep, so complete they might have been carved from stone. Aunt Mercy watched the child disappear up the narrow stairs. "That song," she said, "my grandmother knew that one. Said it was older than memory. It's just humming." Silas picked up his hat from the table. Don't read magic into everything. But even as he said it, he remembered his mother singing something similar when he was small, something about safe harbors and true paths. The memory came quick and left quicker, like a bird landing and taking wing again. Isaiah gathered up his mending and stood. "You best take care with that child, Mr. Silas. She sees more than most folks notice. Remembers it, too. She sweeps floors and fetches water. That's what she's for." The old man's eyes held steady. "Maybe." But I've seen her watch you read the ledgers, seen her trace letters in the dust when she thinks nobody's looking. Child's got a mind like a steel trap. Silas waved the words away. Lot of good that'll do her. Depends, Isaiah said, on what gets caught in it. 20 minutes later, Lila came back down the stairs. She wore her one good dress, brown wool that Aunt Mercy had let out twice, and carried a thin shawl. The blue ribbon was tied around her wrist, barely visible in the lamplight. Silas looked her over with a critical eye. She was small for 10, built like a bird, with skin the color of tea with cream. Her hair was braided tight and pinned up neat. Nothing fancy, but clean and proper. That'll do, he said. Come on. They stepped out into the fog. The air hung thick and still, muffling sound. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed, but it seemed to come from another world entirely. The wagon waited by the kitchen door, hitched to the sway-backed mule Isaiah had chosen for its steady temperament. The beast stood patient in the traces, ears forward, breath steaming in the cool air. You remember what we talked about, Silas said as he helped Lila up onto the wagon seat. You stay close. You speak when spoken to. You don't volunteer information? Yes, sir. And if anyone asks why you're there, you say you're helping with coats and such. Serving. Lila nodded. The blue ribbon caught a glint of lamplight from the kitchen window. Isaiah appeared beside the wagon with a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Biscuits and bacon, he said, handing it up to Silas. Roads longer than you think in this fog. Obliged. Silas tucked the bundle under the seat. He picked up the reins and looked down at Isaiah. Keep an eye on things here. Always do. The old man stepped back and raised his hand. Safe travels. Silas clicked to the mule, and the wagon lurched into motion. The wheels found the ruts in the lane and settled into a steady rhythm. Behind them, the kitchen lamp grew small and yellow, then vanished in the grey. They rode in silence for the first mile. The fog wrapped around them like a blanket, close and damp. The only sounds were the creak of wagon boards, the mule's hoofbeats on packed earth, and the faint jingle of the harness. Then Lila began to hum. It was the same tune from the kitchen, but softer now, barely audible above the wagon noise. The melody wound through the fog like a thread, simple but somehow sure of itself. The mule's ears flicked back and forward, keeping time. Quit that, Silas said. The humming stopped. Don't need to draw attention before we even reach the patrol road. Yes, sir. But 5 minutes later, she was humming again. Silas started to tell her to stop, then noticed something. The mule was moving easier, stepping more sure-footed through the ruts. Even the wagon seemed to ride smoother. He decided to let it be. The fog began to thin as they approached the main road. Shapes loomed out of the grey fence posts, a broken-down barn, stands of pine that crowded the roadside. A mockingbird called from somewhere overhead, running through its borrowed songs. At the crossroads, Silas pulled the mule to a stop. The patrol checkpoint sat 50 yards ahead, marked by a lantern hanging from a post. A man in a broad hat stood beside it, rifle cradled in his arms. Papers, Silas muttered, patting his vest pocket. Remember what I said about staying quiet. He flicked the reins, and the wagon rolled forward. The patroller stepped into the road and raised his hand. The mule stopped without being told. Morning, the patroller said. He was young, maybe 25, with pale eyes and a scraggly beard. A badge hung crooked on his coat, the metal tarnished but readable in the lantern light. Morning, Silas kept his voice even. Headed to the river landing. Papers. Silas pulled out the travel pass and handed it down. The patroller unfolded it, squinting at the writing. His lips moved as he read, working through the words one by one. Says here, you're traveling with household goods. That's right. The patroller looked up at Lila, then back at the paper. This is dated last month. Papers are good for 90 days. Silas's heart hammered against his ribs, but he kept his voice steady. Check the county seal. The patroller held the paper up to the lantern light. The official stamp was there, pressed into the wax, but something about it looked wrong. The letters seemed to run together, and the motto underneath was harder to read than it should be. What's this word here? The patroller pointed to the Latin inscription under the seal. Silas leaned forward, trying to see what the man was pointing at. The motto was supposed to read, Veritas et Justitia, Truth and justice, but in the dim light, he couldn't make out the individual letters. A small voice spoke from beside him. "It should be Veritas, sir. Veritas. But that one says Vertias. The second I is missing." Both men turned to stare at Lila. She sat straight on the wagon seat, hands folded, eyes respectful but certain. The patroller blinked. "You can read Latin?" "Some, sir. I helped clean the courthouse. I've seen the real seal many times." Silas felt the world tilt sideways. This wasn't part of any plan, but the patroller was nodding, looking at the paper with new interest. "Well, I'll be," the man said. "You're right as rain, little miss. That there's a poor copying job if ever I saw one." He folded the paper and handed it back to Silas. "Sorry to doubt you, sir. These forged passes been turning up all over the county." "No offense taken." Silas's mouth was dry as dust. "We all got to do our jobs." "Yes, sir." "Safe travels now." The patroller stepped aside and waved them through. Silas clicked to the mule and they rolled past the checkpoint, wheels crunching on gravel. They rode another quarter-mile before Silas trusted himself to speak. "Where did you learn to read Latin?" "I listen when the judge reads the mottos and such. And I remember what I hear." Lila's voice stayed quiet, matter of fact. "The real county seal has different letters, cleaner, and they use green wax, not brown. You noticed all that from cleaning floors?" "I noticed lots of things." Silas looked at her sideways. In the growing daylight, he could see she was watching the road ahead with the same careful attention she'd given the patroller's badge. Like she was reading something written there that he couldn't see. "Well," he said finally, "I'm grateful you spoke up. That could have gone poorly." "Yes, sir." The mule's ears flicked at Lila's hummed tempo as the ferry lanterns came into view through the morning haze. The river landing buzzed with early morning activity. Teamsters loaded cargo onto the flatboat ferry, while passengers gathered under the weathered awning that served as a waiting area. The air smelled of river mud and wet rope, with an undertone of coffee, brewing somewhere nearby. Caleb True, the ferrymaster, stood at the water's edge checking the boat's mooring lines. He was a thick-built man of 41 with hands like ham hocks and a reputation for getting people safely across the water, regardless of weather. When he saw Silas's wagon approach, he looked up with a nod. "Morning, Mr. Marrow. You're early for the crossing. Got business on the other side." Silas set the brake and climbed down from the wagon seat. "Storm coming?" Caleb squinted at the sky. Clouds were building upriver, dark and heavy. "Maybe. Wind's been shifting all morning. River's running higher than I like, too." He glanced at Lila, who was studying the ferry pole where it stood upright in its socket. The wood was marked with notches and scratches, worn smooth by decades of use. "Little miss there got an interest in ferry work?" "She's helping me with business today," Silas said carefully. "Uh-huh." Caleb's eyes held a knowing look, but he didn't push. "Well, she's welcome aboard. Ferry runs every hour on the hour. Next crossing in 20 minutes. Lila traced one finger along the ferry pole's markings, not touching but following the pattern. "These marks," she said quietly, "they tell the depth?" "Some of them." Caleb moved closer, interested despite himself. "How'd you know that?" "The hymn my aunt sings, about the river crossing. When the water runs to the third mark deep, that's when steady souls can sleep." "I thought maybe." "Well, I'll be blessed." Caleb grinned. "Your aunt knows the old ferry songs? My granddad used to sing those. Thought they were lost." Lila nodded. "She knows lots of them. Says they're like maps, if you know how to listen." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the river breeze. First the Latin at the checkpoint, now ferry songs. What else did this child know that he'd never noticed? A gust of wind rattled the lantern glass, hanging from the awning posts. The ferry boat bobbed against its lines, and somewhere upriver, thunder rumbled low and distant. "Best get you folks across sooner rather than later," Caleb said. "This storm's got teeth." He whistled sharp and loud. The river hands began untying the ferry lines and calling passengers aboard. Silas helped Lila down from the wagon and guided her onto the flat wooden deck. The boat rocked gently under their feet. As they pushed off from the landing, Lila moved to the rail and looked out over the water. The river ran brown and swift, carrying debris from the storm upstream. But she seemed to see something else in the churning current, something that made her hum again, that same threading melody that had quieted the dogs and steadied the mule. "Keep close," Silas said as the far shore grew larger. "The house is just ahead." But even as he spoke, he wondered if he was the one who ought to be staying close to her. The governor's mansion sat on a bluff overlooking the river, 3 stories of white-painted brick with columns that caught the morning light like giant candles. Carriages lined the circular drive, their polished sides gleaming despite the threatening sky. Footmen in livery moved between the vehicles, helping ladies in silk gowns navigate the gravel in their delicate shoes. Silas pulled the wagon to a stop beside a row of more modest conveyances. His hands were damp with sweat despite the cool air. Through the tall windows of the mansion, he could see figures moving in a warm glow of chandeliers and lamplight. "Remember what I told you," he said to Lila. "Stay close. Speak when spoken to. Mind your manners." "Yes, sir." But as they approached the front entrance, Silas's resolve began to crack. The doorway was crowded with guests arriving in their finery, gentlemen in dark coats and high collars, ladies with elaborate hairstyles adorned with ribbons and pearls. The very sight of them made his worn jacket and patched trousers feel shabby as rags. And then Tate Harlan appeared. "Well, well," Tate drawled, stepping away from a group of well-dressed men near the entrance. "Silas Marrow graces us with his presence." At 40, Tate had the soft look of a man who'd never missed a meal, with pale hands that had never held anything heavier than a pen. His coat was new, his boots polished to a mirror shine. "And what's this? You brought a guest?" The men with Tate turned to stare. Conversation began to falter as more guests noticed the oddity, a plantation owner arriving with a slave child on his arm like she was family. Silas felt his face burn red. "You wanted a curiosity, Tate. Here she is. My. Tate's smile was sharp as a blade. "How progressive of you." The words carried across the entrance like ripples on water. Ladies whispered behind their fans. Gentlemen exchanged meaningful glances. A few of the housemen and serving girls craned their necks to see what was causing the stir. Lila stood perfectly straight beside Silas, her chin up, eyes forward. If the stares bothered her, she gave no sign. The blue ribbon at her wrist caught the spill of light from the doorway. "Shall we go in?" Tate gestured toward the entrance with exaggerated courtesy. "I'm sure everyone's eager to meet your companion." Silas gritted his teeth. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? To show Tate and the rest of them that he wasn't beaten yet. To prove that a Marrow could still command attention, even in reduced circumstances. But as they approached the threshold, as the chandelier light fell across Lila's small face and the crowd pressed closer to stare, Silas felt a cold stab of something that might have been shame. Everyone looked twice as the chandelier sang, and Lila crossed the threshold. Inside, the mansion was even grander than it appeared from without. Gas fixtures lined the walls between oil portraits of stern-faced men in military uniforms. The floors were polished heart pine that gleamed like honey in the light. A staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate scrollwork. But it was the silence that struck Silas most. As he and Lila entered the main hall, conversation stopped mid-sentence. The only sounds were the rustle of silk gowns, the soft clink of glasses, and the measured tick of a tall clock in the corner. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tate announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "may I present Mr. Silas Marrow and his protégé." A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, "Well, I never." A woman in emerald green fanned herself vigorously, as if the very sight of them had raised the temperature. Silas searched the faces around him, looking for any sign of approval or understanding. What he saw instead was a mixture of curiosity, disgust, and barely concealed amusement. They were looking at him the way people looked at a performing bear, entertained, but ready to step back if the show went wrong. "How charming," said a woman in purple satin, "and so educational." More laughter, sharper this time. Silas felt his jaw clench. Then a commotion from upstairs broke through the social awkwardness. A woman's voice, high and worried. "Doctor, please, hurry." The crowd turned toward the staircase as Dr. Etienne Rousseau, a slight man with graying hair and wire-rimmed spectacles, hurried up the steps with his medical bag. He was the visiting physician from New Orleans, educated in France, and much sought after by the wealthy planters along the river. "Young Nat has taken a turn for the worse," someone murmured. "Poor child's been burning with fever for 2 days." Lila's head turned toward the stairs. Something in her expression sharpened, like a dog catching a scent. "The doctor will see to it," Tate said dismissively. "Now, shall we continue with—" But Lila was already moving. Not running, not drawing attention to herself, just walking quietly toward the staircase, with that careful, purposeful step Silas had seen when she was cleaning or fetching water. Before he could stop her, she was climbing the stairs, one hand trailing along the polished banister. Where is she going? The woman in purple satin looked scandalized. "Someone should—" Silas started after her, but Tate caught his arm. "Let her go," Tate said with malicious satisfaction. "Let's see how far your curiosity takes her." On the second floor, Lila followed the sound of urgent voices to a bedroom where lamplight spilled through the half-open door. She could hear the doctor's voice, calm but worried, and a woman weeping quietly. She knocked softly on the doorframe. "Yes, doctor." Rousseau looked up from the bedside where a small boy lay flushed and still. The child couldn't be more than 7, with dark hair plastered to his forehead by sweat. "Excuse me, sir," Lila said politely. "I heard the child was ill. I've helped with fever before." The doctor's eyebrows rose. This was not what he'd expected. "I appreciate your concern, but—" "Doctor," the boy's mother interrupted. "Please, if there's anything." "Doctor." Rousseau studied Lila for a moment, then stepped aside. "What is your name?" "Lila, sir." "Very well, Lila. The boy is Nathaniel Marrow, young Nat. His temperature has been rising steadily. I've prepared a draft to bring down the fever, but—" He gestured to his medical bag, where papers protruded from the top. One of them showed a prescription written in a flowing hand, with Latin words in the margins. Lila approached the bedside carefully, studying the child's flushed face and labored breathing. Then her eye caught the prescription paper. She read it quickly, her lips moving silently as she worked through the Latin phrases. "Sir," she said quietly, "may I ask about this dosage?" Dr. Rousseau frowned. "What about it?" "The notation says, quinquais per diem, 5 times daily. But for a child this size with such a high fever—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "My Aunt Mercy taught me about willow bark and such. She always said fever medicine for children should be ter per diem 3 times daily. 5 times might be too much for such a little one." The doctor's face went pale. He snatched up the prescription and examined it closely. "Mon Dieu," he breathed. "You are quite right. I wrote this in haste, the Latin confused me. 5 doses would indeed be dangerous for a child this age." He quickly scratched out the error and rewrote the prescription. "How did you learn to read medical Latin?" "I listen, sir, and I remember." "Words are important when someone's life depends on them." Dr. Rousseau looked at her with new respect. "Indeed they are, young lady, indeed they are." Lila moved closer to the bed and began to hum, very softly. It was a different tune this time, slower and more soothing. Aunt Mercy had taught it to her for calming frightened children. As the melody threaded through the room, young Nat's breathing began to ease. His restless movements stilled, and some of the flush faded from his cheeks. "Remarkable," the doctor murmured. "The child responds to your voice." "It's just counting," Lila said. "Aunt Mercy says rhythm helps the body remember how to rest." She continued humming while Dr. Rousseau prepared the corrected medicine. The boy's mother sat in a chair nearby, tears still wet on her cheeks but hope beginning to bloom in her eyes. When they came back downstairs 20 minutes later, the gathering in the main hall had grown. More guests had arrived, and the conversations were livelier, fueled by punch and the novelty of the evening's unexpected entertainment. But when Dr. Rousseau appeared at the top of the staircase with Lila beside him, the room fell quiet again. "Ladies and gentlemen," the doctor announced, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "I must share something remarkable. This young lady has quite possibly saved a child's life tonight. Her knowledge of medicinal dosages and her calming influence were extraordinary." A murmur ran through the crowd. Silas felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, like the moment before lightning strikes. "How interesting," Tate said, but his smile was thinner now. "Perhaps we should hear more about these talents." And as if summoned by his words, County Clerk Josiah Sutter appeared at the mansion's front entrance, shaking rain from his coat and calling for the governor's attention. In his hand, he carried a leather portfolio stuffed with official documents. The night was just beginning. The county clerk arrived like storm wind itself, his coat dripping and his face flushed with the importance of urgent business. Josiah Sutter was a thin man with fingers permanently stained black from ink and eyes that never seemed to rest on any one thing for long. He clutched his leather portfolio against his chest like a shield. "Governor," he called across the main hall, "I must speak with you. There's been developments with the runaway situations along the river." The crowd parted to let him through. Sutter nodded to various guests as he passed, his gaze lingering on Silas with particular interest. When he spotted Lila standing quietly beside Dr. Rousseau, his eyes narrowed. "Mr. Sutter," the governor said, appearing at his elbow. "What brings you out in this weather?" "Forged papers, sir. We've caught 3 runaways this week, all carrying passes that looked official but weren't. Someone's been selling false documents." Sutter opened his portfolio and pulled out a sheaf of papers. "I've got samples here of the real ones for comparison." He spread the documents on a side table, gesturing for interested parties to examine them. "See here, the authentic county seal uses green wax, always, and the letter forms are quite specific. We've had to be extra vigilant." Leela moved closer, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. The papers lay under the lamplight like fallen leaves, some yellow with age, others crisp and new. But one caught her attention immediately. It was a travel pass dated the previous week, authorizing the movement of one Negro boy, age approximately 14, traveling north to Alexandria on family business. The seal looked right at first glance, the county motto in Latin, the official stamp pressed into wax. But something was wrong. "Excuse me, sir," Lila said quietly. Sutter looked down at her with obvious displeasure. "Yes, this paper here, the one for the boy traveling north, the seal isn't right." A hush fell over the nearby guests. Sutter's face darkened. "I beg your pardon? The motto should read Veritas et Justitia, but this one has the letters wrong. And the wax." Lila studied it carefully. "This is brown wax, but you said authentic papers use green." Sutter snatched up the paper, his face flushing red. "How dare you question official documents? This pass was issued by my office under proper authority. But if you look close," Lila continued, her voice steady despite the anger in the clerk's eyes, "the J in Justitia has the wrong serif. It should curve left, but this one curves right. And there's no impression of the ring seal on the back." Dr. Rousseau stepped closer, interested. "May I see that?" Sutter reluctantly handed over the paper. The doctor examined it under the lamplight, his spectacles glinting. "The child is quite right. The letter forms are inconsistent, and this wax appears to have been melted from a candle rather than a proper seal. Preposterous." Sutter's voice cracked slightly. "You're taking the word of someone who clearly has excellent observational skills." "Doctor," Rousseau finished calmly. Tate Harlan pushed through the crowd, his eyes bright with malicious interest. "What's all this commotion about?" "It seems," said the governor slowly, "that we may have a forged document in our midst. The question is how it came to be in the county clerk's possession." Sutter fumbled with his papers, sweat beading on his forehead despite the evening's chill. "There must be some mistake. The confusion with the wax colors, perhaps, or—" "There's no confusion," Lila said quietly. "I clean the courthouse every week. I've seen the real seal dozens of times. This isn't it." The crowd pressed closer. Conversations buzzed with excitement and suspicion. Someone whispered, "How could a child know such things?" Another voice answered, "Maybe that's exactly why she does know. She pays attention to what adults ignore." Silas felt the ground shifting under his feet again. This wasn't the kind of attention he'd wanted. Lila was drawing notice, yes, but the wrong kind, the dangerous kind. "Perhaps," Tate said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "we should examine some other documents, just to be thorough." He pulled a folded paper from his inner pocket. "I happen to have some of Silas's debt notes right here. Family obligations, you understand. Maybe the young lady could tell us if these are authentic." Silas's heart hammered against his ribs. Those were the papers Tate had been using to pressure him, threatening foreclosure if the debts weren't paid, if they were examined too closely. But before anyone could respond, thunder crashed overhead. The mansion's windows rattled in their frames, and the lights flickered as wind howled around the building. "Goodness," said a woman in blue silk. "That storm certainly has arrived. Lightning flashed outside, throwing weird shadows across the room. In the brief, stark illumination, everyone looked like strangers, their faces pale and sharp-edged, their eyes reflecting the electric light. "Perhaps," said the governor diplomatically, "we should continue this discussion in a more formal setting. Mr. Sutter, I trust you'll investigate these irregularities thoroughly." "Of course, sir." Although I maintain that another crash of thunder cut him off. This time the lights didn't just flicker, they went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness broken only by the occasional flash of lightning through the tall windows. "Servants," the governor called. "Bring candles, lanterns." In the confusion that followed, as housemen hurried to provide light and guests exclaimed over the sudden darkness, Silas grabbed Lila's arm. "We're leaving," he whispered urgently. "Now, before this gets worse." But Lila didn't move. "Mr. Silas," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm, "there's something else. About the ledger." "What ledger?" "The old one in the glass case by the library door. I saw it while everyone was arguing about the papers. There's something wrong with the entries." "Lila, we don't have time for—" Lightning flashed again, and in that brief moment of illumination, Silas saw her face. The same careful attention he'd noticed at the ferry landing, but intensified now, like she was reading something written in the air itself. "The ledger shows the same child sold twice," she said. 3 months apart. Same name, same age, but different buyers. And the ink's different too, like someone added the second entry later. Silas stared at her. "You remember all that from a quick look?" "I remember everything," Lila said simply. Before he could respond, servants arrived with armloads of candles and oil lamps. The warm light pushed back the darkness, revealing faces flushed with excitement and wine. The storm had transformed a polite social gathering into something more intimate and dangerous. "Well," said Tate, his voice carrying clearly in the restored quiet, "this certainly has been an educational evening. Perhaps we should retire to the library where we can examine these documents more carefully. And maybe," his smile gleamed in the candlelight, "our young scholar can tell us more about what she's observed." Sutter's face went pale as milk. "That's entirely unnecessary. I'm sure there's a simple explanation." "Oh, I insist," Tate said. "After all, if there's been any irregularity in official documents, we should get to the bottom of it, for the good of the county." The crowd began to move toward the library, drawn by the promise of scandal and revelation. Candles bobbed like fireflies in the dimness, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Silas felt trapped between bad choices. Leave now and look guilty. Stay and let Lila dig deeper into things that might destroy them both. But as they followed the crowd toward the library, Lila began to hum again. The same melody that had calmed the dogs and steadied young Nat's breathing, only now it seemed different, more complex, with layers Silas hadn't noticed before. It sounded, he realized with a chill, like directions, like a map sung in a minor key. And in the library, where the antique ledger waited under glass, more secrets were about to spill into the lamplight. The library smelled of leather and old paper, with undertones of pipe tobacco and wax from the candles the servants had hastily arranged around the room. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls, filled with volumes on law, history, and natural philosophy. But it was the glass display case near the French doors that drew everyone's attention. Inside the case lay an open ledger bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. A small placard identified it as County Records 1838 to 1842, Property Transactions and Estate Settlements. "Now then," said the governor, producing a key from his waistcoat, "let's have a proper look at this historical document, though I'm not sure why it would be relevant to our current discussion about travel passes." "Evidence comes in many forms," Tate said smoothly, "and our young friend here seems to have a remarkable eye for detail." As the governor unlocked the case, Lila moved closer. The candlelight flickered across the open pages, revealing column after column of entries written in a clerk's careful copperplate. Names, dates, descriptions of property changing hands. Most of it routine business from a decade past. But Lila had been right. There, halfway down the left page, was an entry that made several people lean closer. Negro girl, age approx. 10, sold by estate of Marcus Webb to Josiah Kettering, sum of $400, Witness this 12th day of March, 1841, and 3 columns to the right, in slightly different ink, Negro girl, age approx. 10, former property Webb estate, sold by J. Kettering to Samuel Morrison, sum of $450. Witnessed this 15th day of June, 1841. Well, said Dr. Rousseau thoughtfully, that's interesting. The same child, apparently sold twice within 3 months. Nothing unusual there, Sutter said quickly. Sometimes property changes hands rapidly. Business considerations, debt settlements. But Lila was studying the entries more closely. The handwriting's different, she said. Look at the J in Kettering. The first entry has a proper serif, but the second one doesn't. And the ink color the second entry is browner, like it was written with a different pen. A murmur ran through the crowd. Someone whispered, "How can she see such details?" "May I suggest," said a voice from the back of the room, "that we examine some contemporary documents for comparison?" Everyone turned. It was Caleb True, the ferrymaster, who had apparently arrived with other townspeople seeking shelter from the storm. His usual work clothes were soaked, and he carried his hat in his hand like a man coming to church. "Mr. True," said the governor, "what brings you out in this weather?" "Ferry's out of service until the storm passes, sir. River's running too high and fast. I brought some of the stranded passengers here for shelter." He gestured toward the doorway, where several other men stood dripping in the candlelight. "But I couldn't help overhearing your discussion. And if you're looking at property records from that time period..." Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out a wrapped bundle. "I've got the ferry logs from those same years. Keep them for tax purposes. If this girl was moved across the river multiple times, there should be records." He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a series of leather-bound notebooks. "June 1841, you said." Caleb flipped through the pages, his thick fingers surprisingly gentle with the old paper. "Here we are. June 15th, 1841. He read aloud. "1 wagon, Josiah Kettering, traveling light. No passengers declared. No fee collected for human cargo." Silence settled over the room like dust. "No passengers, Doctor," Rousseau repeated thoughtfully. "But if he had just purchased a child..." "Exactly," said Caleb. "Ferry regulations required all human cargo to be declared and fees paid accordingly. If Kettering crossed that day without declaring a child, then either he didn't have one, or the transaction recorded in the ledger never actually took place," Leela finished quietly. Sutter's face had gone from pale to grey. This is speculation based on ancient paperwork. Surely we don't need to..." "Mr. Sutter," interrupted a new voice. Reverend Pike had entered the library, his black coat streaming with rainwater. At 58, he was a tall man with silver hair and eyes like deep water. I couldn't help but notice the commotion. "May I ask what's being discussed?" Quickly, the governor summarized the discoveries about the ledger entries and the forged travel pass. As he spoke, Reverend Pike's expression grew increasingly grave. "These are serious accusations," the preacher said when the governor finished. "If there's been falsification of official records, particularly regarding human property..." "It's all speculation," Sutter burst out. "Based on the imaginings of a child who, Reverend," Pike said quietly, "has demonstrated remarkable accuracy so far this evening." He moved to the display case and studied the ledger entries himself. "Mr. Sutter, as county clerk, you would have access to the seal and official materials needed to create false documents. I'm not suggesting anything yet, but I think it would be wise to examine your office records more thoroughly." Lightning crashed outside, followed immediately by thunder that shook the mansion to its foundations. The French doors rattled, and somewhere upstairs, something heavy fell and shattered. "Gentlemen," said the governor uneasily, "perhaps we should postpone this investigation until..." "No," said Lila clearly. "Please. If people are being sold twice, if papers are being forged, then someone's in danger right now. While we're standing here talking, someone might be getting hurt." The room fell silent. In the candlelight, the child's face looked older than her 10 years, marked by a gravity that made even the adults uncomfortable. "She's right," said Caleb. "And the storm's getting worse. Nobody's leaving tonight anyway. Might as well settle this properly, another voice spoke from the doorway. Then perhaps you should know that there's more than just ledger entries at stake. It was Isaiah Reed. The old man stood in the entrance to the library, water dripping from his coat, his weathered face set in grim lines. "Isaiah," Silas said in surprise, "what are you doing here?" "Aunt Mercy sent me," said the storm was bringing trouble and someone needed to watch over Miss Lila. His eyes found the child in the candlelight. "Good thing, too. Sounds like she's stirring up the devil's own nest." "Do you know something about these transactions?" Reverend Pike asked. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from face to face around the room. Finally, he spoke. "I know that 10 years ago there was talk of children disappearing from estate sales, bought by one man, sold to another, but never actually delivered to the second buyer." "That's a serious accusation," said the governor. "Yes, sir, and I know because one of those children was my grandson." The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Even the storm seemed to pause, as if waiting to hear what would come next. "He was sold off the Peterson estate," Isaiah continued. "Bill of sale said he went to a buyer in Mississippi. But the Peterson overseer told me later he saw the boy again, months after the supposed sale, working on a place near Baton Rouge. Different name, different papers, but the same child." Sutter was backing toward the door, his face now the color of old parchment. These are fantasies. Gossip and speculation from people who might know more about your business than you think, Reverend Pike said grimly. He turned to Isaiah. "Do you have any proof of these claims?" "No, sir. Just an old man's word. But if someone was to look in the right places, ask the right questions." He glanced at Lila. "Maybe check what this child remembers from cleaning the courthouse." All eyes turned to Lila again. She stood very still in the candlelight, the blue ribbon at her wrist catching the flame's flicker. "There's a locked drawer in Mr. Sutter's desk," she said quietly. "He opens it every Tuesday when he thinks nobody's watching. There's something green in there that he takes out and puts back. And papers tied with red ribbon." "How could you possibly see?" Sutter began. "I sweep under the desk every week. I see where shadows fall. And I hear the lock click different when there's something heavy inside." Thunder crashed again, closer this time. The mansion's lights flickered, and somewhere in the building, a shutter tore loose and began banging against the wall like a drum. "Mr. Sutter," said Reverend Pike formally, "I think it would be appropriate to examine that drawer. You have no authority. As county clerk, you're an elected official. And if there's been malfeasance in office, the people have a right to know." The preacher's voice carried the weight of moral certainty. "The storm has trapped us all here together. Perhaps God intends for these matters to be settled tonight. The courthouse is locked," Sutter said desperately. "And in this storm—" "Actually," said Caleb, "it's not locked. I have the keys the county pays me to check for flood damage after storms, and it's only 2 blocks away." The trap was closing around Sutter like a net. His eyes darted from face to face, looking for support or escape. What he found instead were expressions of growing suspicion and determination. "Very well," said the governor heavily. "If we're going to do this, we'll do it properly. A formal examination, with witnesses, but in this storm." As if summoned by his words, a tremendous crack of thunder shook the building. The candles guttered, and one of the French doors burst open, letting in a gust of wind and rain that set all the flames dancing wildly. Through the open door, they could see the storm in all its fury. Lightning flickered almost continuously now, illuminating sheets of rain that fell like curtains across the town. The river, visible as a dark ribbon in the distance, was swollen far beyond its banks. "Nobody's going anywhere in this," Caleb said grimly. "Not until it passes." But Lila was humming again, that same complex melody that seemed to carry more meaning than mere music. As her voice threaded through the storm's noise, several people noticed something odd. The tune seemed to be pointing somewhere, like it was giving directions through the chaos. And suddenly, Lila stopped humming and spoke into the candlelit silence. "The courthouse is flooded, but the clerk's office is on the 2nd floor. And there's a way to get there from here without going outside." Every eye in the room turned to stare at her. "How could you possibly know that?" Sutter whispered. Lila's answer was simple and devastating. "Because the hymn told me. And hymns don't lie. The tunnel was older than anyone remembered, built in the early days when the governor's mansion served as a courthouse and jail. It ran beneath the main street, connecting the mansion's cellar to the foundation of the current courthouse building. Most people had forgotten it existed, but Lila's hymn had remembered. Third verse, second stanza, she explained, as they descended the mansion's cellar stairs by lantern light. When the water rises to the door, seek the passage laid before. Stone and timber, darkness deep, where the faithful secrets keep. Caleb held the lantern high, its yellow glow pushing back the shadows. The cellar was packed with forgotten furniture, old paintings, and trunks full of papers. But at the far end, behind a stack of broken chairs, was an iron door set into the foundation stones. "I'll be blessed," Caleb muttered. "Been in this building a dozen times, never noticed that door." "Because it was meant to be hidden," Reverend Pike said. "Emergency route for officials during Indian troubles, most likely." The door opened with a screech of rusty hinges. Beyond lay a tunnel carved from the living stone, its walls slick with moisture and age. The air smelled of earth and old water. "Passage is narrow," Caleb warned, holding the lantern forward to illuminate the way. "We'll have to go single file. And careful, the stones are wet." The procession that entered the tunnel would have seemed impossible an hour earlier, the county clerk reluctantly leading the way, followed by Reverend Pike, Dr. Rousseau, Silas, Lila, Isaiah, and several other men who had appointed themselves witnesses to whatever was about to unfold. Their footsteps echoed off the stone walls, and their lantern light threw jumping shadows that made the tunnel seem alive. Halfway through the passage, Sutter stumbled. Whether by accident or design, he dropped the leather portfolio he'd been clutching all evening. Papers scattered across the tunnel floor, some landing in puddles of seepage from the storm above. "My documents!" he cried, falling to his knees to gather them up. But Lila was quicker. She knelt beside him and began collecting the scattered papers, her small hands moving efficiently in the lantern light. As she lifted one of the documents, a travel pass signed just that morning, she paused. "Mr. Sutter," she said quietly, "this signature isn't yours." "What do you mean?" "I've seen you sign the courthouse ledgers every week. Your S always has a loop at the bottom, but this one doesn't." She held up the paper so the others could see. "And the ink's still wet, like someone signed it recently." "Doctor?" Rousseau examined the document closely. "She's quite right. This signature is different from the one on the other papers." "Who signed this?" Reverend Pike demanded. Sutter's face was a mask of sweat and desperation. There must be some mistake. In the confusion of the storm." "No mistake," said Lila. "Someone else has been using your seal. Someone who knows how to copy your signature but can't quite get it right." The implications hung in the tunnel air like smoke. If Sutter wasn't the only one with access to the official documents, if someone else was involved in the forgery scheme, "We need to reach that office, Reverend," Pike said grimly. "Now." They pressed forward through the tunnel, emerging finally into the courthouse basement through another iron door. Water had indeed risen in the building's lower level, but the stairs to the upper floors were still passable. The courthouse at night was a different creature from the busy daytime building Lila knew. Their footsteps echoed in the empty halls, and shadows lurked in every doorway. Lightning flashing through the tall windows threw brief, stark illumination across the portraits of dead judges and the glass cases of legal documents. Sutter's office was on the second floor, a cramped room lined with filing cabinets and stacked with years of paperwork. The clerk's desk sat by the window, its surface littered with inkwells, seals, and ribbons in various colors. "The drawer," Reverend Pike said simply. Sutter fumbled with his keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the small key into the lock. When the drawer finally opened, everyone crowded around to see its contents. Inside were several items that made the men exchange grim glances. A brass seal with green wax still clinging to its base, a stack of blank travel passes tied with red ribbon, and a smaller leather notebook filled with names and dates. Dr. Rousseau lifted out the notebook and opened it to a random page. "These are records of forged documents," he said slowly. "Names, dates, fees collected, and—" he looked up with horrified understanding. "There are 2 different handwritings in here." "Let me see that," Caleb demanded, taking the book. As he read, his weathered face grew hard as stone. "My God," They've been selling the same people multiple times, creating false identities, moving them between plantations, collecting fees from buyers who never received what they paid for. Who's they? Reverend Pike asked. The answer came from an unexpected source. Lila was studying the brass seal with the same careful attention she'd given everything else that night. "This isn't the official county seal," she said. "It's close, but the motto's wrong. And look here," she pointed to a maker's mark on the seal's base. T. H. "Those are someone's initials." Silence fell over the room like a weight. "T. H." Silas repeated slowly. "Tate Harlan. That's impossible," Sutter burst out. "Mr. Harlan is a respected member of the community. He would never, wouldn't he?" Dr. Rousseau was reading further in the notebook. "Because according to this, he's collected fees for at least 20 forged documents in the past 6 months. And there's a note here about the Marrow situation, something about using debt papers to force cooperation." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. "The debt papers he threatened me with tonight. If they're forged, then your father never owed that money," Reverend Pike finished. "And your land can't be seized." Thunder crashed overhead, so close it seemed the lightning had struck the building itself. The lights flickered and went out, leaving them in darkness except for their lanterns. In the sudden silence that followed, they could hear something else. Footsteps in the hallway outside. "Someone's coming," Caleb whispered. The footsteps paused outside the office door. Then a voice called out, smooth and confident despite the circumstances. "I know you're in there. I suggest you come out and we can discuss this like civilized men." It was Tate Harlan. "How did he get here?" Dr. Rousseau whispered. "Same way we did, most likely," Isaiah said grimly. "Man knows this town as well as anyone." "Mr. Harlan," Reverend Pike called through the door, "we're conducting official business here. I suggest you return to the mansion and wait for—" "I don't think so," Tate's voice interrupted. "You see, I've brought some friends with me. Men who understand the importance of maintaining order, of not letting certain irregularities become public knowledge." Through the window, they could see lantern light in the street below. Several men on horseback sat waiting in the storm, their faces hidden by the brims of their hats. Even in the rain and darkness, there was something menacing about their stillness. "What do you want?" Sutter called out. His voice cracked with strain. "What I've always wanted," Tate replied. "A reasonable solution to a complex problem. Mr. Sutter, you've served this county faithfully for many years. No one wants to see your reputation destroyed over a few minor administrative irregularities. And Mr. Marrow, well, his debts are quite real, whatever the source of the documents. Surely we can reach an accommodation." "And what about the people who were sold twice?" Lila asked, her voice carrying clearly in the silence. "What about them?" A long pause, then Tate's voice, colder now. "Children should be seen and not heard, especially children who don't understand the complexities of adult business." "I understand enough," Lila said. "I understand that you've been stealing people's lives and selling them like they were cattle. I understand that you threatened Mr. Silas to keep him quiet. And I understand that you're scared because a 10-year-old girl can read better than you thought." Another crash of thunder, and this time the lightning revealed something that made everyone in the office catch their breath. Through the window, they could see water rising in the street below. The storm was flooding the town. "Tate," Caleb called out, "you need to get your men to higher ground. This flood's going to be worse than anything we've seen. I'll worry about my men. You worry about making the right choice. Because this storm won't last forever, but the consequences of what happens tonight will." Reverend Pike moved to the window and looked down at the rising water. "He's right about one thing. We're going to be trapped here until the storm passes, but that also means he's trapped too." "Not necessarily," Isaiah said grimly. "Man like that probably has more than one exit planned." Leela was humming again, so softly it was almost lost under the storm's noise. But as her voice threaded through the room, the others began to notice something. The melody seemed to be mapping something again, not directions this time, but timing, like a countdown. "What is it?" Silas asked quietly. Lila stopped humming and looked directly at him. "The storm's going to get worse before it gets better, but there's something else coming. Someone else. The hymn says, 'When the water reaches the heart of the house, then truth will find its voice.' And I think," she paused, listening to something only she could hear, I think that means help is coming. As if summoned by her words, they heard new voices in the hallway. Men's voices, but different from Tate's companions. Authoritative voices that carried the weight of law. Sheriff's office. This is Deputy Marshal Crawford. We're here on official business. The door to Sutter's office opened, and a tall man in a rain-soaked coat stepped inside. Behind him were two other men carrying federal badges and grim expressions. "Evening, folks," the marshal said, water dripping from his hat brim. "Heard there might be some irregularities with county documents that fall under federal jurisdiction, particularly regarding interstate commerce in human property." Tate's voice from the hallway had lost its confident tone. "Marshal Crawford, this is unexpected. Mr. Harlan." "Yes, I imagine it is." The marshal's eyes swept the office, taking in the open drawer, the scattered papers, and the group of witnesses. "We've been investigating reports of forged travel documents for some time. Tonight seemed like a good time to follow up on those reports." "And how exactly did you know to come here tonight?" Tate demanded. The marshal smiled grimly. "Someone sent word, a message delivered this afternoon, before the storm hit. Detailed information about when and where evidence might be found." He looked at Lila with something approaching wonder. Message was signed by someone who called herself a friend of justice. Lila's eyes widened in surprise. "But I never sent any message." "No," said a familiar voice from the doorway. "But I did." Everyone turned. Standing in the entrance to the office, dripping wet but smiling, was Aunt Mercy. At 58, she looked small and fragile beside the federal marshals, but her eyes held a fire that made even hardened lawmen step aside respectfully. "Aunt Mercy." Leela ran to her, and the older woman's arms closed around the child like a shield. "How did you know?" Silas asked in amazement. "Child," Aunt Mercy said, "I've been watching and listening longer than most folks have been alive. When I heard Mr. Tate daring you to bring Lila to that fancy party, I knew trouble was brewing. So I sent word to folks who needed to know." She looked around the room with satisfaction. "Sometimes an old woman's network is faster than a young man's schemes." The marshal moved to the desk and began examining the contents of the drawer. "This is exactly what we were looking for. Mr. Sutter, Mr. Harlan, you're both under arrest for conspiracy to defraud, forgery of official documents, and violation of federal commerce laws." "Now see here," Tate blustered. "You can't just—" "Actually, I can," the marshal said calmly. "And I have a feeling this young lady can tell us exactly where to find the rest of the evidence we need." All eyes turned to Lila again. She stood in the circle of Aunt Mercy's arms, no longer just a child who cleaned floors and fetched water. In the lantern light, with the storm raging outside and justice finally arriving, she looked like what she'd been all along, a witness to truth that adults had chosen not to see. "Yes, sir," she said clearly, "I can tell you everything." And as thunder crashed overhead and lightning illuminated the flooded streets below, the real reckoning finally began. The formal proceedings lasted until the gray hours before dawn. In the courthouse's main chamber, by the light of oil lamps and candles, Lila told her story to a room full of witnesses. Her voice never wavered as she recounted months of careful observation. The wrong serif on forged seals, the color differences in wax, the duplicate entries in ledgers, the sounds of secret meetings in rooms she was supposed to be cleaning. Federal Marshal Crawford took notes in a leather-bound book, his pen scratching steadily across the pages. County officials who had arrived as the storm passed sat grim-faced as the scope of the conspiracy became clear. Dr. Rousseau testified about the medical error Lila had caught, establishing her credibility as a witness. Caleb provided ferry records that contradicted the forged sales documents. Reverend Pike offered character testimony and legal precedent from his knowledge of county law, but it was the evidence from Sutter's locked drawer that sealed the case. The notebook contained details of at least 30 forged documents over 2 years, with Tate Harlan's initials appearing as co-conspirator on more than half of them. The false seal with his maker's mark made his involvement undeniable. As Marshal Crawford read the charges aloud, Tate's composure finally cracked. "You're taking the word of a slave child over established members of the community," he burst out. "This is madness." "No," said Reverend Pike quietly. "This is justice." The child told the truth. "You didn't. It's that simple." Sutter, broken and sweating, had confessed everything once the federal charges were read. The money from selling forged papers, the split proceeds with Harlan, the deliberate targeting of desperate plantation owners like Silas who could be blackmailed into silence. It was a web of corruption that had lasted years, hidden in plain sight because no one thought to question the authority of official documents. "What about the people who were sold twice?" Lila asked during a break in the testimony. "The ones who got separated from their families?" Marshal Crawford's expression was grim. "We'll do what we can to trace them through the records, reunite families where possible, but some of those trails may have gone cold." "The boy who was my grandson," Isaiah said quietly. "There any chance?" "We'll look," the marshal promised. "Federal law takes precedence over state sales when fraud is involved. If he's alive, if we can find him, there may be remedies." As the official business wound down, another matter arose that no one had expected. "Reverend?" Pike approached Silas with an old Bible in his hands, its leather binding worn soft with age and handling. "Mr. Marrow," the preacher said formally, "there's something in your family's history you should know about. Something your mother mentioned to me before she died, but I never had occasion to discuss with you." He opened the Bible to a page near the back, where someone had written in the margins in faded brown ink. The script was careful and feminine, clearly the work of an educated woman. "Your mother wrote this," Reverend Pike continued. "A family covenant based on an old law from Virginia that was carried over into Louisiana territory. Any minor who saves the life of an heir through quick thinking or medical knowledge shall be considered free by act of divine mercy, the debt of bondage paid by service to God through service to family." Silas stared at the words. I never knew about this. Your mother was a godly woman who believed in the possibility of redemption. She wrote this after your father bought Lila's mother, hoping that someday." Reverend Pike gestured to Lila, who stood nearby listening with wide eyes. "Tonight, this child saved your nephew's life with her knowledge of medicine. According to this covenant, and witnessed by these people, that service fulfills the condition. You're saying, I'm saying that if you choose to honor your mother's wishes, you have grounds to free the child legally. Here. Tonight, with proper documentation that no one can contest." Silas looked around the room at the faces watching him. Dr. Rousseau nodded encouragingly. Marshal Crawford waited with his pen, ready to witness whatever document might be signed. Aunt Mercy and Isaiah stood together, hope and wariness warring in their expressions. And Lila watched him with those careful, observant eyes that had seen through every lie and deception of the evening. "The land," Silas said slowly, "with the debt papers proven false." "Your property is clear," Marshal Crawford confirmed. "Mr. Harlan's claims have no legal standing. Your father never owed those debts." Silas was quiet for a long moment, the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders. Outside, the storm had finally passed, leaving behind the sound of water dripping from eaves and the distant call of birds greeting the approaching dawn. "Reverend Pike," he said finally, "do you have the proper forms for a legal manumission?" "I do." "Then let's do this properly." The paperwork was surprisingly simple. A declaration of freedom, signed by the owner and witnessed by officials. The county deputy who had replaced Sutter heated green wax and pressed the genuine seal, the real one, not Harlan's forgery, into the warm surface. Lila watched, fascinated, as her legal status changed with the stroke of a pen and the impression of metal in wax. When it was finished, Reverend Pike handed her the document. "This makes you free, child. Free to go where you choose, work where you will, learn what you can." Lila took the paper carefully, her small fingers tracing the seal. Then she looked up at Silas. "What happens now?" "That's up to you," Silas said. "You've got family here, Aunt Mercy, Isaiah, people who care about you. Or if you want to go somewhere else, find other opportunities." He paused, as if the words were hard to say. "You saved my nephew's life tonight. More than that, you saved my honor. Whatever you choose, you'll have my support." Lila considered this for a moment. Then she asked, "Would there be room for me to stay? Not as property, but as—" she searched for the right word. "As family?" The question hung in the air like morning mist. Silas looked at this small, serious child who had upended his world in a single night, who had shown him truths he'd been too proud or too frightened to see, who had somehow managed to save them all. Yes, he said quietly, there would be room for that. As the official party prepared to leave the courthouse, taking the arrested men with them, Marshal Crawford pulled Reverend Pike aside. That child, he said quietly, she's remarkable. Her memory, her powers of observation with the right education. I know, Reverend Pike said. We'll see that she gets what she needs. The Lord doesn't grant gifts like that lightly. The wagon ride back to the plantation took place in the strange, clear light that follows a storm. The air was washed clean, and everything seemed to shine with fresh possibility. Lila sat beside Silas on the wagon seat, the manumission papers folded carefully in her pocket, the blue ribbon still tied around her wrist. That song you were humming, Silas said as they traveled the now familiar road, the one that seemed to give directions. How did you know? Aunt Mercy taught it to me when I was little, Lila replied. She said it was a map song, from before there were written maps. People who needed to remember safe paths would sing them, pass them down through families. I just listened to what it was telling me. And you remembered all those details about the documents, the seals, the handwriting. I pay attention, Lila said simply. When people think you're just cleaning around them, they don't notice you noticing. But everything gets remembered. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sun break through the last of the storm clouds. The world looked newly made, green and bright, and full of promise. At the plantation, Aunt Mercy had breakfast waiting. The kitchen smelled of biscuits and bacon, coffee and fresh butter. Young Nat was up and about, his fever broken, chattering excitedly about the excitement he'd slept through. Isaiah had already seen to the animals and was mending storm damage to the barn roof. So, Aunt Mercy said as they gathered around the kitchen table, what happens now? It was the question everyone was thinking, but no one quite knew how to answer. They were the same people they'd been the night before, but everything had changed. Legal papers had been signed, crimes had been exposed, a child had been freed, a family had been redefined. Now, said Silas, looking around the table at faces both familiar and somehow new, we figure out how to be who we're supposed to be. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. I've been thinking about this all the way home, about what kind of household this should be, now that we're starting fresh. He unfolded the paper, a simple contract written in his own hand during the wagon ride. Wages for work, he read aloud. Schooling for any who want it. Sunday rest for everyone. Fair treatment and honest dealing. He looked up. Anyone who wants to stay on these terms, you're welcome. Anyone who wants to go somewhere else, you'll have letters of recommendation and traveling money. Aunt Mercy nodded approvingly. Sounds like what should have been all along. Miss Lila, Silas continued, you'll have a room of your own, proper clothes, books to learn from, and if you want to help with the accounts and correspondence. He smiled. Well, it seems you've got a talent for noticing when things don't add up right. Lila considered this. Would I still be able to help Aunt Mercy in the kitchen sometimes? I like cooking. Child, Aunt Mercy laughed, you can help me with anything you want to. Free or not free, you're still my girl. As they ate breakfast together, the conversation turned to practical matters. The damage from the storm, the crops that would need replanting, the legal proceedings that would continue as more victims of the forgery scheme came forward. Normal life, but built on a new foundation. Young Nat, recovered from his fever and full of energy, climbed into the chair beside Lila. Will you teach me that humming song? He asked. The one that helped me feel better? If you want to learn, Lila said, but you have to promise to only use it for good things. It's not just music, it's memory and truth and finding your way when you're lost. I promise, Nat said solemnly. And as Lila began to hum the gentle melody that had carried them through the storm, other voices joined in. Aunt Mercy's warm alto, Isaiah's steady bass, even Silas's uncertain tenor. The kitchen filled with harmony that seemed to promise better days ahead. Outside, the mule that had carried them through the night wandered freely in the pasture, no longer hitched to any wagon. When Lila approached the fence after breakfast, the animal came to her immediately, nuzzling her outstretched hand without need of rope or tether. Look at that, Isaiah observed, joining her at the fence. Horse follows you like your family. Maybe we all are now, Lila said, stroking the mule's soft nose. Different kind of family than before, but family all the same. She pulled the blue ribbon from her wrist and retied it around the mule's neck, a gentle marker of freedom and trust. The animal stood patiently as she worked, then followed her along the fence line as she walked back toward the house. On the kitchen porch, the family, for that's what they were now, legally and truly gathered as the morning sun climbed higher. The sealed manumission papers lay on the table where everyone could see them, proof that justice had been done and truth had prevailed. "So, what do we do first?" Silas asked, looking around at these people who had somehow become his true household overnight. "First," said Reverend Pike, arriving on horseback with the morning mail and news from town, "we give thanks. And then we get to work building something better than what came before." He dismounted and joined them on the porch, adding his voice to the hymn that had begun spontaneously, the way hymns do when hearts are full and the morning is bright with possibility. With the sealed paper under her ribboned hand, Lila led the first verse, and the porch filled with amens. The storm had passed, and in its wake, a different kind of morning dawned, one where truth mattered more than custom, where courage counted more than color, and where a child's clear voice had changed the course of lives forever.